For centuries, the majority of white Americans viewed Native Americans strictly as barbarians. That racist notion prevented what could have been an exchange in cultures, and instead manifested in the cultural assimilation that took place in American Indian boarding schools. Our story begins in 1754. The 1750s were a hoot. The American colonies were prospering, men's fashion was flourishing, and the French and Indian War began. The French and Indian War was essentially Britain and France fighting over land. It started out with France owning about this much and Britain owning about this much. It ended with Britain pretty much owning everything. Our story starts in Pennsylvania during the French and Indian War. Here lived the Jemison family. One spring morning in 1755, the Jemison family was attacked by a band of French and Indian soldiers. They looted their house and took almost all of the family prisoner. The prisoners were marched through the woods for a day. That night, 2 of the children were pulled aside while the rest of the family was murdered. The 2 children were brought back to the Indians' village. Now, in that time, the Native Americans had a custom where if a family member died in battle, they would receive a prisoner. They would mourn over that prisoner, and afterwards they would choose to kill or adopt them. Little Mary Jemison was adopted into an Indian family at the age of 12. She lived with Native Americans her whole life, and subsequently became one. Jump forward to 1823. Mary is 80 years old now and is living on land given to her by her Native American family. By this time, she was married twice and had 8 children. Mary agreed to tell her story to a local doctor, James E. Seaver. Now this is where things get interesting, because what Mr. Seaver wrote twisted Mary's story in certain parts, and he inserted his agenda into her story. This is the book James Seaver wrote, A Narrative Life of Mrs. Mary Jemison. To set up the whole tone of the book, let me just show you the opening sentence of the author's preface. The peace of 1783 and the consequent cessation of Indian hostilities and barbarities returned to their friends those prisoners who had escaped the tomahawk, the gauntlet, and the savage fire. This kind of derogatory verbiage is scattered all throughout the book. And what makes it especially sneaky is that this is written from the viewpoint of Mary herself. The best way to tell you what I'm trying to describe is with the term rhetorical drag. Rhetorical drag appropriates the body of the captive woman and explains how her experience should be understood through the historical vision of the impersonator. The impersonator in this case being James Seaver. It would be impossible to show you the extent of this rhetorical drag in Mary's narrative because it's in so many places. However, I will show you one instance where you can see the clash in voices most clearly. In the final chapter of the book where Mary is reflecting on her life, she says this: When I consider my reduction from a civilized to a savage state, and the various steps by which that process has been effected, and that my life has been prolonged and my health and reason spared, it seems a miracle that I am unable to account for. The negative tone of this passage directly contradicts the thoughts of the subject in question. Calling her journey a reduction from a civilized to a savage state seems absurd when you're given the correct context. Mary wouldn't refer to her family as savages. In her lifetime, she had the opportunity to return to white society twice, but she refused to go both times because she loved her Indian family and she was happy where she was. The worst part of all this is people ate this stuff up. I mean, of course you would if you had an Indian captive confirming your prejudice. And this isn't the only example of this kind of writing. This is Increase Mather's book from 1676. The only thing I need to show you is the first sentence of this book. That the heathen people amongst whom we live, and whose land the Lord God our Father hath given to us for rightful possession. If that doesn't just scream white supremacy, I don't know what does. And the whole book just repeats this idea. One more example of this kind of ideology can be found in the story of Olive Oatman in 1851. She had the same kind of rhetorical drag written into her narrative. But what is more significant with her is the tattoos she received in captivity. These tattoos were portrayed as a sign of savagery. However, Olive herself talked about the kindness of the Indians in many interviews, and many have debated over whether the tattoos were not a sign of savagery, but rather a sign of assimilation into Indian culture. This idea of whites being superior to Indians can be seen carried all the way from 1676 to 1851 in these different pieces of literature. That idea manifested itself in many forms, one of the most recent being American Indian boarding schools. Some of the first government-funded boarding schools were started around 1860. Many of these schools were started with good intention, but over time they devolved, and the children in these schools weren't taken care of properly, and the main goal became to assimilate Indian children into American culture. In 1928, there was a report released on Indian administration in the United States. The Merriam Report was a document over 800 pages long. What went wrong with the boarding schools is what follows. 1. Housing. Many schools housed students in primitive dwellings. Students were made to sleep in badly ventilated shacks, usually sharing beds with other children because of overcrowding. The furnishing in these shacks was very limited, and sanitation in the dorms was substandard. Because of that, children in these places were more susceptible to contracting a disease. 2. Diet. Most schools only supplied meat, starches, and water. Most schools had major vitamin deficiencies in their menus. You were lucky to get fruit or veggies, and if you did, it was because it was in season on the school farm. Indian Services did try to establish standards to keep Indian children healthy, but because of the lack of funding, many schools struggled to reach dietary standards. Because of poor diet, children were even more susceptible to disease. The most prevalent diseases being tuberculosis and trachoma. And guess what? And I quote, "The medical service rendered the boarding school children was not up to a reasonable standard." 3. Education. Because Indian Services couldn't offer decent salaries, they had to lower the standards for their staff. Otherwise, they couldn't get qualifying applicants. Subsequently, there were many inexperienced teachers teaching at these boarding schools. On top of their regular educational activities, children would be taught trades. Those above the 4th grade ordinarily work for half a day and go to school for half a day. Many schools were partially supported by the labor of the students. And when students were taught substantial trades, they were only taught them at basic levels, so that when the students graduated, they couldn't actually compete in a job market. And in some cases, it was questionable as to whether the schools were breaking child labor laws or not. 4th and finally, cultural assimilation. The Merriam Report refers to this section as family and community development. Here's a quote from that. "The belief has apparently been that the shortest road to civilization is to take children away from their parents and insofar as possible to stamp out the old Indian life." And that's exactly what happened. Children would be ripped away from their home and brought to these boarding schools. About 8% of the entire Indian population was in government-funded boarding schools by 1926, about 25,000 kids. At the boarding schools, they were made to speak English, forced to dress and cut their hair in an American fashion, and made to learn American customs, such as Victorian-style dining. They were punished if they didn't comply. In some places, the punishments were severe. Many weren't allowed to return home for years. Because of their separation from family, some became sick or depressed. The children who took it worst sometimes committed suicide. Even when students returned home, it wasn't the end of their woes. After spending so many years in a boarding school, sometimes a child would forget their own family. They would get out of school and feel as if they were a stranger in their own home. Before I finish talking about the boarding schools, I want to mention that not everybody had a bad experience in these boarding schools. Some people voluntarily attended boarding school hoping for a better life. Many enjoyed their time in boarding schools. But that doesn't excuse the fact that these schools were grossly underfunded, most of the children were not properly cared for, and the fundamental goal of assimilation was just toxic. What amazes me most is the hypocrisy of this whole situation. For centuries, Americans refused Indian culture. They demonized their practices and painted their own ideologies as the dominant entity. That idea manifested itself in so many things, these boarding schools being one of the most recent. And because of this, instead of what could have become an exchange in cultures, the main goal became kill the Indian and save the man.